Let's make a start. So welcome everyone. If you're here to talk about getting ready for delivery of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, then you're in the right place. There's quite a backdrop to this. It's a pretty hostile environment funding-wise for councils right now. I think the indications we're getting is that the government is not going to reopen the spending review, which means that councils are going to have to absorb a lot of inflationary increases in costs, and some of the figures that are being bandied around is that might mean a real terms cut of around 18 billion. Things are moving quite quickly. There seem to be a lot of changes around, so we don't know where exactly that will land. But what this does mean is that it is essential that you make best use of the funding you have. A lot of you on here, if you're from mayoral combined authority, a district council or a unitary authority, will have over the summer been preparing a shared prosperity fund investment plan. Those are now being assessed by the government, and we should be finding out quite soon, although I'm not exactly sure when, whether those have been passed or not. But with the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, it's very likely that you will get the funding. It's not a competitive process, unlike the Levelling Up Fund, which absolutely was a competitive process and seems to have been oversubscribed quite a bit. You will, as part of your Shared Prosperity Fund investment plan, you will have made commitments to spend money this year. And what that means is that you really need to hit the ground running when that funding arrives. So today's webinar is all about how you do that and how important that is. So we're going to be talking about transforming your investment plan, which I think anyone who's completed it will know it's pretty high level. There's not a lot of detail in it. So transforming that from a high level plan into a more detailed implementable plan that actually has the right amount of detail there, which you can actually implement, because at the minute they're all quite high level plans. It's about getting the right resources in place so that when you do get your funding, you're in a position where you can you can really get going and hit the ground running, as I said. Want to think about processes you might go through in terms of procuring partners. A lot of this is stuff that you won't be able to do yourself. And then also, if you're designing new services and new offers, then you're going to have to think about that work. And obviously, as part of the fund, you could have put in some requests for funding to do feasibility studies, and we want to talk a little bit about that as well. And then finally, obviously, monitoring and evaluation is very important, and we will talk a little bit about that. So my name's Andrew Laird, and I'm the Managing Director of Mutual Ventures, and I'm joined today by my colleague Mark Bandali. Mark has been with Mutual Ventures for over 10 years now, actually, very near the start, and has supported a lot of councils over the past couple of years to do Levelling Up Fund bids and also Shared Prosperity Fund investment plans. So I thought Mark would be really well placed to give some of his insight into what needs to happen now. And we're not going to use any slides. Mark and I are just going to have a conversation, and I hope that works. I usually enjoy my conversations with Mark, so I hope you do too, and I hope you find it interesting. Just in terms of housekeeping, we are recording this, so if you want to share with any of your colleagues who might have missed it later on, you can do that, but no need to write everything down. And as I said, we're not using any slides. So Mark, you're very welcome. Good to see you. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Hi Andrew, hi everyone.
Excellent. So Mark, let's get cracking here. So I've got a question for you here about priorities councils have. So they're obviously under a lot of pressure on services and budgets. They're trying to deal with cost of living crisis, that kind of thing. The mini budgets now opened up opportunities around investment zones and things. So with all those pressures and priorities, why should councils see early preparation for the delivery of UK Shared Prosperity Fund as a priority?
Okay, so it's a good question. I fully agree with your statements around the pressures that local authorities are under at the moment, both in terms of them as organisations, but also their communities, the businesses they support, and importantly, the third sector and community organisations. Everyone is under pressure. I think if we take a step back and look at what the Shared Prosperity Fund is, it's ultimately a fund for local authorities and their partners to invest between now or whenever the decision is, until the end of March 2025. My first sort of point on why this is important and why I'd argue that councils need to prioritise this is going back to your point, Andrew, about the pressures of cost of living on communities, around the uncertainty that businesses are facing. And the third sector and other community organisations have become, to a point, reliant on some of this information, which, ultimately used to come from European funds. So there are numerous structural reasons, but also in terms of need, in terms of supporting businesses and really promoting inclusive growth. And that comes back down, I think, to outcomes. This is an investment in outcomes and in inclusive growth. So the sooner that happens, post go live, as it were, the better, because there is obviously acute need here. And there is a need to really invest in the future, both of services, but of communities and residents. So the first point really is around meeting need and supporting economic growth. That I think is a really important one. The second point is more practical. My understanding of the fund is that, as I said, the money needs to be spent by March 2025. Councils would have included within their submissions spend in this financial year, 2022-23, and also a lot of important outputs and outcomes next financial year. So for this to happen, for these to be realised within the timescales, it's important to do the heavy lifting now in terms of the thinking and so on. So this is incredibly important preparation work. And ultimately, I think there is some flexibility around which year money is spent, but ultimately this money needs to be invested by councils and their partners by March 2025, or there's a question mark about whether they'll receive their full sum. So my second point is around the financial driver really behind this, and maximising every penny that is available to local authorities and their partners to invest as timely as possible to realise the outcomes, but also to ensure that they get the money that they're allocated. So, for those reasons, and they are relatively high level, and each council will be in a different position, I think doing as much as you can around council readiness now to implement it is essential for those reasons.
Thanks, Mark. I would completely agree. And just to pick up on something I briefly mentioned at the start, this is one of the few central government funding pots that particularly districts will get. So making the best use of it is incredibly important. It would be very easy to squander it and not make use of it properly, and actually not come up with anything sustainable and lasting. So I think the earlier the thinking, the more likely it is that your plans will be robust and will be sustainable and will create something enduring, rather than leaving it to the last minute and just spending it on whoever shouts loudest. And that might be only a fleeting benefit rather than something which is lasting. So I completely agree with everything you said there. Just for people listening, you can put your own questions into the Q&A function. So please do, and Mark and I will try our best to get to those. Sorry, I should have said that at the start. Mark, something else which has struck me and may strike a lot of people listening is that the level of detail required in the submission for the Shared Prosperity Fund, to me anyway, felt like a lot less than the applications for the Levelling Up Fund. The Levelling Up Fund bids felt like very close to a full Treasury 5 case business case. A lot of detail around economic analysis, etc. A lot of detail around implementation plans. Most of that was missing from the Shared Prosperity Fund investment plans. And actually, I mean, it was a bit of a stretch to call the application an investment plan, at least in the way you and I would look at it. So given the fact that the councils are likely to get this funding, but at the minute, the level of planning is very high level. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how that impacts a council's readiness to hit the ground running?
So I think it's a good point. There is a disparity between the level of detail in the levelling up fund application templates and that in the investment plans. Part of that, I think, is the nature that levelling up fund was capital and was trying to attract projects, propositions that were pretty well developed, whereas the investment plan for shared prosperity was not last minute, but it needed to be done quickly on top of the day job. And I think there was some of the reason for the higher level of detail is because of that. But ultimately, your point, I think, is a good one. There is a gap in terms of, okay, we've done the implementation plan. Can we now deliver, press the button and get going? There's this void that exists in terms of implementation planning and actually defining more about what it is we're planning to invest the money in. So, you know, the investment plan did ask councils to identify what projects they would, you know, they're supporting to address challenges and maximize opportunities. It covered a lot of issues, but at a very high level. So the argument, I think, I'd put forward, certainly, and some of the councils I'm working with are doing the same, is to get to readiness, to get to the point where we can implement. There is this gap, and, you know, for example, there isn't an implementation plan, a project plan or delivery plan within the investment plan. It looks at it, when are you going to spend the money and when are the outputs and outcomes going to be realized. That doesn't talk about the how, and it doesn't actually talk about the what. So while there's a gap, I think that local authorities are generally pretty strong at the project planning, the implementation planning. But then even in order to get to that point, I think there's quite a lot of work to do to define services, to think about things like procurement and actually the cost of services. How we, you know, if we're going to deliver in-house, what's it going to cost? And if we're going to procure, what's the contract value for that? There needs to be a lot of meat on the bones, I think, that fills that gap between where we are now and where we'd need to be to start investing with confidence on day one. So just a couple of examples, and I've mentioned a few already. If we're talking about services, this is a revenue fund, majority revenue fund anyway. We need to be, as councils, need to be very clear about what the service will do, what it will be, what problems it's trying to solve, what need it's trying to meet. If there are capital elements, well, you know, there's a process there around defining exactly what the capital investment will be. We need to think about the operating model and the resources needed to deliver or to procure and to project manage these things. I've mentioned procurement already. There's governance considerations. And, you know, there are, for example, lots of grant funding projects included within investment plans, but these can be very complicated to implement. So understanding the criteria in order to access these grant funds, who will manage it, what the intended outcomes will be. All of these things need to be thought through. I'm not saying councils haven't done it, but it wasn't asked for in the investment plan to any level of detail. So there is that gap. And importantly, you know, there is the opportunity to identify match funding in the Shared Prosperity Fund. So that will, you know, that's not going to sit around forever. That needs to be sort of formalized, that needs to be agreed and fed into this process when we're defining services and procurement arrangements and governance and so on. So there's an awful lot of work to do here. And just one final point on that, the way the investment plan is structured, and this isn't a criticism, this is just the way it was structured. At the moment, it's not obvious how much services will cost and what outcomes and outputs attributed to particular projects. It's sort of looked at in an intervention by intervention level, government interventions and descriptions. So it's one way of looking at the world, but actually, if you're looking to implement effectively in a timely manner, there is this massive gap in the middle that needs to be thought through, in my view.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I know that the way we work, even though the investment plans didn't require it, we started our process with the councils we supported to do shared prosperity funds by doing a theory of change, which obviously the investment plan almost calls for the two bookends of that. So a clear articulation of what the challenges are and a clear articulation of what outcomes you're trying to achieve. And then you tick a lot of boxes to do with interventions. But a theory of change model can be a good way of starting because it makes you think more logically about how the interventions you're actually going to fund and what they actually do. Because at the minute, they're just names. really, how those interventions actually resolve the challenges and achieve the outcomes that you're trying to do. So we found that, and you might want to comment on this yourself, Mark, but we found that that exercise working with senior teams and councils to be very useful in terms of getting everybody on the same page and getting all of the key people understanding the overall vision and why they're doing the things that they're doing.
Absolutely, and it's a really important part of the process. And I think a lot of councils would have gone through something similar, theory of change, or calling it something different. And I think the bookends is the right way of describing it. What are the challenges and what does good look like? This middle bit is going back to my answer. It is the real bit where you will get confidence in terms of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and when we're doing it. I'll just give an example of how we're supporting one council in particular to fill this gap. Part of this is filling the gap, but part of this is also sort of in relation to the democratic decision-making process. If we go back to LUF just very quickly,
which is the majority levelling up fund.
Levelling up fund, sorry. The majority of councils who submitted levelling up fund applications had some form of cabinet or committee endorsement prior to submitting it. The majority that I've worked with around the investment plans haven't had that. Now, part of the reason there is the detail isn't there, but actually the councils that I'm working with want elected members essentially to sign off on the expenditure for shared prosperity. So in order to do that, they've adopted a business case approach, which really flushes out that middle bit that we're talking about where the gap is. So I'm not advocating 150-page full business cases, but what I am suggesting, and the process we're going through with a couple of them, is really to take the investment plan on, to develop it in terms of defining these services, defining the operating model, how will things be delivered in-house or procured, what are the governance arrangements going to be, what options have we looked at and discounted, all of the things you'd expect in a business case. But importantly, it allows additional considerations around equalities and diversity, subsidy control, things that may have been parked actually as holding positions in the subsidy, in the investment plan returns. But also, going back to governance, it's a very good way of demonstrating to elected members how they will be involved in the oversight and scrutiny of this process. And the council, as the accountable body, will need to think about these things. So the full business case approach is one way, and I'll stress it's not the only way, it's one way of filling this gap, understanding what we're going to deliver, who's going to deliver it, how we're going to get to a position to deliver things, and what outcomes and outputs will be achieved. And also importantly, because this is so cross partnership, it's the council with the third sector organisations, businesses and community groups, what the governance as well as the delivery of that looks like. These are all really important considerations. The business case approach is one way of filling that gap, I think, and taking the investment plan on one step. The feedback I've had from councils that we're doing this with is that it is an effective way of flushing out the issues that require consideration and further development. Yeah. And it is helping them to get to the point where they feel more ready to deliver and implement once they get a decision from central government about their investment plan. So I'll stress it's one way of doing things rather than the only.
Yeah, so I want to get into some of the detail of what councils need to do now in terms of more clearly defining what those services and interventions are. But just to go to a question that we've had come in. So it's from an anonymous attendee, and I can kind of see why, but it's saying preparatory work we intended to undertake on the UK Shared Prosperity Fund has now been sidelined by the need to submit a rural England Prosperity Fund addendum and investment plan. We know that people are still waiting for the Rural Fund FAQs, which means it's difficult for people to progress as it could impact the implementation of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund as well. And the question at the end here is, how well thought out do you think this process has been, in your opinion? Now, I couldn't possibly comment, but what I will say is that we're acutely aware that councils, particularly districts, has been asked of them. Two districts that we've supported that are in partnership with each other with a single leadership team over the past 6 months have submitted 3 levelling up bids, 2 shared prosperity fund investment plans, and now are in the process of preparing 2 rural England prosperity fund plans. So I don't think they've ever had to submit more bids for funding ever. And these are councils that are lean in terms of their infrastructure. So like, in terms of this question, I think there certainly has been a desire to get, to put it crudely, some money out the door to their target areas to invest and to put some investment on the ground. I think that a lot of areas, a lot of councils are playing catch up in terms of having the capacity to actually realise all of that, and never mind getting the bid in. Getting the bid or the investment plan in is one step, but actually implementing it is going to be a whole new challenge. So in terms of the question, how well has it been thought through? I think it is what it is, and councils, particularly districts, are going to have to think about capacity and think about how they're going to actually implement this. But it is true, if this is the kind of core of the question, that a lot more than ever before, probably in terms of central government demands, have been asked of councils, particularly district councils, than ever before.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just add? Well, the person who submitted the question, I don't think they were the only council representative surprised when they got the email about this new fund and needing to tie it into the shared prosperity. I accept it's a challenge. I accept the point about there being an impact on the original investment plan. Andrew, something you said, I think, is a helpful way of looking at this. If a council has done a theory of change and is sort of a part of a rural council, I think there would have been some of the market failures or challenges relating to rural businesses or rural communities, of which the Rural England Prosperity Fund is focusing on. So hopefully there is this sort of strategic blueprint that hopefully some of this can slot into. I think, and this is me talking hypothetically, and it's easier said than done, but with the Rural England stuff, I would advise to sort of not conflict, but hopefully complement what you've proposed in the investment plan with what you're proposing. And even if it's a slightly tenuous strategic link, it's still there. Obviously, Rural England is a majority capital fund as well. So there is, with shared prosperity being majority revenue, there is potentially a way of complementing this. It is a bit tail wagging the dog to a point. You wouldn't design a process like this, but actually where we are. And I think there are opportunities there to see how we can complement what we've already submitted in the investment plan with propositions or interventions that do meet need, and trying to sort of match it that way. But I appreciate this is not an ideal process. It's additional work that wasn't foreseen. But ultimately, back to the first point where we started here, this funding, to be seen as essential and timely and a way of really investing in communities, residents, that this is easy for me to say, but ultimately I think that it's a frustration, but there are potentially opportunities here as well, if it can be linked back to the strategic narrative.
Absolutely. So just going to another one of our questions here. So this is about getting into some of the detail of, defining the services. What should you be thinking about when taking this to the next level of detail? Because I know that you've been doing some of this work with some councils already.
Yeah, so I think if we just take a very basic example, there's the council within its investment plan has identified a new service to meet unmet need and plug a gap in service provision currently. So I think councils are generally pretty good at doing this just through experience. Ultimately, you need a service specification. What will the service do? And you need an outcomes and outputs matrix, in terms of answering the so what question, what will be achieved? There is a sort of important question here. Are we looking to replicate and do what we've previously done, or are we looking to introduce innovation or reflect emerging need in a different way? And that might be one of the reasons why you're thinking about, for example, a new service. There are also considerations. What's the delivery model? Is this going to be an in-house council run service? or is it going to be commissioned, procured? Is it going to be delivered in partnership, or is this going to be shared across other councils? So all of those things, you know, there's a lot of regional working in the investment plans that I've seen. So these are important considerations. We'll need to know how much it costs. So you'll need to understand, you know, everything from staffing to support service, input, premises, everything you can think of, but also think about legacy costs. If you are employing new staff, then there's things around pensions, redundancy liabilities, all the things you'd associate with employing new staff. There'll also be project management responsibilities around implementation. You'll need a project plan to implement around, you know, to implement the service, and then the monitoring and evaluation element, answering the so what, has this money, has this investment, has this service achieved what it was set up to do? So, you know, lots of local authorities are very good at setting up new services, either by themselves, and there's a real opportunity here to co-produce services with communities, businesses, or third sector organisations. What's in the investment plan is conceptual with a bit of detail, I think, in most cases. And it's about padding this out, going back to basics. What are the needs and the challenges we're trying to solve, and then designing a service that's A, affordable, but B, in a very good position to address head on that level of need, unmet need, or any challenges faced outside by local businesses and so on.
Yeah, and I think as part of that, thinking about what the service is going to be and exactly how it's going to deliver, is bringing in partners to work with you.
Absolutely.
And one of the biggest challenges we observe councils facing is just getting things that they need procured quickly and doing that in a sensible way that's good value for money. So certainly in the both the levelling up bids and the shared prosperity fund bids that we've supported, partners will be needed. External organisations will be required to deliver significant aspects of them. So what should councils be thinking about in terms of getting all of that lined up?
So I think if we just take procurement, it's a really interesting one. So let's go back to the example of the council having a new service, and let's assume that the idea is that the council won't directly deliver it, that it will procure it. The challenge with procurement is obviously the lead times are significant often, and you know, going back to where we started here in terms of readiness and wanting to get going as soon as we get authorization to spend, there are challenges there, which strengthens the argument for thinking about procurement up front, because of just simply of the timescales involved. But in order to do that, we'll need a service specification, idea of what the service is we need, but also that sort of outcomes matrix, what benefits will be realized. I'd advise these decisions need to happen in order for things to move forward. So if the decision is to deliver it via a procured third party, for representatives to talk to their procurement and commissioning colleagues to understand what the procurement routes are available here, because you know, each council has different thresholds, each council will have a different appetite for risk, but there's everything on that procurement spectrum, from a public tender exercise which is open to everyone, to a restricted tender, and everything through to, you know, a direct award. There's no one answer to this stuff, but actually having those conversations now and knowing the procurement route is really important. Another aspect that's really important is making sure that we're assuming that the market can deliver something. So actually, as well as developing the spec and the procurement route, supporting the market, understanding the market, and engaging with the market to work out what they can deliver. We don't want to get to a point in 6 months when we've gone out to the market with a wonderful spec and an outcomes matrix, and the market says, no, we can't deliver that. So it's really important, and I know some councils are already doing this, it's really interesting, engaging with the market to warm them up, to test, to understand what's possible to deliver. You don't want to assume anything. But on the other hand, there are things that councils can be doing now. And if you are going to procure a service, there will be things around market engagement events I've talked about, the award criteria, payment profiles, monitoring and evaluation requirements, contract management arrangements, all of those things that are in the council's gift to start padding out now and developing so that they can hit the ground running. There is a lot of work involved here, but you know, I mentioned engaging with procurement and commissioning within a council. It's really important to do, because this stuff takes time, and it's not one person's view either.
No, I would entirely agree. I think the two big takeaways from there are engage with your procurement teams early, figure out, you don't have to kick the procurement off, but figure out what your strategy is going to be. How are you going to do it? Do you have a supplier in mind that you're going to do a tender with, or do you need to do an open competition? And do that market engagement work as well. You can engage with the market, say we've put in an investment plan for this. We haven't got it confirmed yet, but we're getting ahead of the game. We're letting you know what our thoughts are, and you're allowing your potential partners to get their act together to enable you to hit the ground running. So I think there's two really big takeaways there. Talk to your procurement professionals early. Decide with them what your strategy is going to be to procure what you need. Were you to be successful to get the funding, which for Shared Prosperity Fund you're likely to be, and then think about that market warming exercise and an event or a couple of roundtables or something, just so people know what is coming, so that they can get planned and ready for it. Mark,
sorry, Andrew, can I just add to that? Sorry. My example was for a new service. I'm aware that lots of councils are identifying funding to continue existing services, which are delivered outside of the council. So while it isn't the same problem, there's still things that councils can be doing. Again, talking to procurement colleagues and working out whether actually a contract extension can be done in terms of procurement regs or is desirable. But also then talking to the provider about if you want to do things differently or if there's a different focus on the service. So you can do that up front now and have those conversations to lay the groundwork for what may come in the future. So it's not just for new services that you're looking to commission. There's also the existing commission services where you can start looking at this and talking to the incumbent provider and having those conversations.
Yeah, great. So another question in here about working together with neighbouring councils to deliver work. So obviously there was quite a heavy emphasis in the investment plan to indicate whether and in what areas you would intend to work with other areas, and I think that's most interesting from a district's perspective, because there will be stuff in here that it makes sense to do at a larger scale than at the district geography. So the question that the person has submitted is about, how much can we progress on that front before really knowing what exactly we've got?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think each council will work differently, but going back to the point you've made a few times, Andrew, one could run a scenario where you assume that a council receives the funding that it has been allocated and it will be doing what it said in the investment plan. There's a scenario there which you could then take forward to your regional forums and partnership meetings and networks, and basically start talking about what this looks like. If it's a new service or if it's an existing service, you'll still need to have the same conversations. It's likely that councils have slightly different priorities for the same intervention. There'll be local variance in terms of these priorities, but also activity levels based on local need. At a regional level, there will be all these variances which need to be worked through. But there's also sort of governance issues which can be quite difficult around, is one council going to be the lead commissioner or lead provider on this? And if so, what role do the other councils have as they move forward? I think it's a good idea to if you are comfortable in assuming that scenario that I've outlined, have these conversations across each of the investment priority areas, communities in place, supporting local businesses and people and skills, and have those conversations early, because what you don't want to do is leave them late. And we don't know how long this piece of string is really. It's best to have those conversations as soon as possible. So look, it is a challenge, but there's as with any regional working, there's huge opportunities here. But they do take time, they are intricate, and everyone is coming from a slightly different position, but it's more about what brings you together than sort of divides you in terms of what you're looking to achieve.
And I certainly know in some parts of the country, we're certainly advising some councils on partnerships between each other, particularly districts looking to make themselves more of a voice, to give themselves more of a voice to become more sustainable in the future. So this investment plan is a really good hook to have those conversations on. So maybe it starts with working together on this and then eventually progresses to something else. So Mark, this is one of my own questions here. So unlike the Levelling Up Fund bid, the Shared Prosperity Fund investment plan doesn't specifically ask about capacity and capability to deliver. It asks for some details on team members and gaps, but what should sorry, I beg your pardon. It does ask. Sorry, it does ask about capabilities. Sorry, I don't know. It asks about team members, capabilities, gaps, etc. Now, what should people be doing now to ensure that they plug those gaps? Because everybody, I mean, I don't think we've supported one of these where there weren't at least some gaps being identified.
Absolutely. So this comes back to the sort of operating model to deliver shared prosperity. You know, the council will be the accountable body for this funding, and it will need to demonstrate to central government that it's been invested in the way it was intended to and realise the benefits that were prescribed. So around that, there are skills, capacity and resources needed to project manage this efficiently and effectively to make sure that implementation is done to time, to cost and to quality. So a PMO team, I think, is important, both from a sort of operational oversight perspective, but also feeding into wider governance around risks issues and technical issues. So I think a project management team, it would be critical to oversee the whole implementation between whenever the start is in March 2025. That's a critical bit of the skills, capabilities and capacity. Another consideration, and this depends really if a council's investment plan is weighted towards in-house delivery or to procure services, but in reality there will be this mixture. You know, there will be this sort of blending in all likelihood. But if you are delivering in-house, you'll need to make sure obviously that you do have the staff available and capable to deliver services. If, as I've mentioned, if you are looking to procure services, you'll need to make sure that the market has the capacity and the capabilities to deliver. So there's this sort of in-house look at things from a project management and service delivery perspective, but also externally making sure that the market is in a position to successfully deliver, and they do have the capabilities and skills to do that.
Yeah, I think there's two separate things. There's the commissioning that you will need to do in order to deliver the activities and the interventions, and then there's also the internal capability, as you've been talking about now, to actually manage the process, project manage the implementation of it. And you know, different councils are taking different approaches. Some of the larger councils will have teams in their corporate centre who are there to do this type of thing. That's fine. A lot of the smaller councils that we're dealing with, and maybe even some of the mayoral combined authorities as well, just aren't geared up currently to deliver additional time limited programs, and are looking for other solutions as to how they actually do that.
Yeah, and I think these are really important, because this is the lifeblood of implementation. If you don't have the capacity to implement, it's not going to go where you want it to at the pace you want it to.
Yeah, and it's not going to embed, it's not going to be sustainable, it'll be less impactful. That's our experience.
So, I mean, some practical examples of what councils can be doing now. You know, if there are gaps in service delivery or project management, if your councils aren't comfortable recruiting now until they get the decision, well, you know, there's a piece of work around job descriptions, personal specifications, getting ready to the point where you can go out to recruitment. It's also worth thinking about corporate support services, getting them engaged and understanding their role in the process. So legal, finance, HR, IT, whatever it may be, they're likely to be involved in some way in the implementation of shared prosperity. You know, an example is financial controls. If there is some sort of procurement arrangement, the money will need to be, you know, under contract, distributed to providers. This requires systems, it requires controls, it requires insurance, and it requires a contract management system. It's unlikely that, you know, so corporate support services will have a role here. My final point on things that can be done now, but not sort of implemented, establishing or designing shadow governance arrangements. There was a question in the investment plan which asked councils to outline this, but you can go a step further in terms of developing draft terms of reference, reporting requirements, decision-making powers and protocols and things, to really, in shadow, on a blueprint, design what this will look like, have it discussed, and then actually the work's done. So when you do get the green light, you're not starting from a standing position.
Okay, good. So we've only got one more question on the Q&A function. So if you've got any final questions, do pop them in here. This is the last one on this, and then I've got a final one myself. But so this last question, very exciting, is asked about monitoring and evaluation. I know it's one of your favorite topics, Mark. So I guess none of us have put in place the monitoring and evaluation bits for Shared Prosperity Fund yet, but we supported levelling up round one bids last June, and pre-June, the submission was June. Those all had to have monitoring and evaluation bits in place, and I know that you specifically are working with some councils and have been ever since. So what's the experience of putting monitoring and evaluation in for those, and how can that learning, I presume, is very transferable to Shared Prosperity Fund?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. So I think the starting premise is that both the council and their partners and central government will want to understand the impact of Shared Prosperity Fund investments. To answer the sort of so what in terms of communities in place, local businesses, and the skills agenda. So there is this need to demonstrate the impact that the Shared Prosperity investment has had. So if we accept that, but we also accept that as the accountable body, the council will want to know how the implementation of it is going. So the more monitoring aspect of it rather than the evaluation. If those two things are true, then councils need to think about having or establishing systems to allow for both the monitoring and the evaluation to happen. So we need to identify what the intended benefits are per service or per investment theme, and agree those need to be embedded within service delivery plans if they're delivered in-house, or in contracts if things are being procured, to make sure that there is going to be this sort of network of levers that can be pulled to get the information when it needs to be done. You've mentioned levelling up fund round one. So we're working with a council who committed as part of their bid to appoint a external third party who would act as their monitoring and evaluation partner through the Levelling Up Fund. They are now extending that brief to include the monitoring and evaluation of the Shared Prosperity Fund. So ultimately, you've got one external partner doing the same thing. Yes, they are looking at slightly different things, but it's essentially two sides of the same coin. If you look at the interventions and the outcome matrix for Levelling Up Fund and Shared Prosperity, they're looking at the same thing. They're looking at reducing deprivation. They're looking at inclusive growth. They're looking at skills. They're looking at higher skilled, higher paid jobs, and so on. So ultimately, if you're doing your theory of change, they're broadly similar in terms of what they're looking to achieve. So while the programs are different, they're looking at the same sort of thing. So that's one example of how you can do it. And I know not every council on here will have secured round one LUF funding or secure round two, but I suppose it's not necessary. My point is, don't necessarily create a new system just for this program. Have a look at what's around in terms of ongoing monitoring and evaluation. There may be existing processes or programs that are looking at outcomes across communities and the success of local businesses, which you could tag this onto in a meaningful sense, not just as an afterthought. But bear in mind that if the Levelling Up Fund is anything to go by, central government will require ongoing returns which demonstrate progress in terms of implementation and some of the early impacts. So it's not like, I'd be amazed if there wasn't a similar process for Shared Prosperity. They will want to know rightly what the impact of this investment has been from a central government perspective. So it's not to be, as councils are thinking about service design and how they're going to deliver and what they want to achieve, this is a pretty good time of thinking about the monitoring and evaluation, not using it as an afterthought, because we know it's important. And it can really help councils to work out, and their partners to work out what's worked and what hasn't, and why. Yeah,
excellent. So we always like to let people go a little bit before they are, but before we do, I want to run through what, just from our conversation and listening to you, Mark, what I think the maybe immediate kind of 5 things councils need to do, and then you can tell me if you think I've left anything out. So the first thing is to consider, you know what's coming, certainly with shared prosperity fund. You may also have a number of levelling up bids in the mix as well. You might have some rural England prosperity funding also. So you need to think about your capability and capacity to deliver the implementation of it. Now that means, you know, are you going to create that in-house? Do you have it in-house, or do you have to bring in support? Then I think the first thing you need to do is be thinking about detailed project planning. So that stuff we talked about right at the start, where you're turning that very high level Shared Prosperity Fund investment plan submission into something more detailed with proper milestones, and you know any dependencies, and you've got a good plan there. Then for some of the interventions and some of the things that you will have proposed, you're going to have to actually get down and design them. And for some of you may have included some feasibility study funding. So that's really what that's intended to do. That's the kind of work to actually plan your market intervention before you can actually do it. And I think that will reveal very much that process, whether you need external partners. And that leads me on to my kind of final 2 points, which is about that early engagement with procurement colleagues, legal colleagues, about what routes you're going to use. And then my final point was that once you know what you need and you know what route you're going to do, then you can then engage with your local suppliers and wider suppliers in order to see what the market can do. Those are the 5 things I had. Mark, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, that's a really good way of summarising my ramblings over the last half an hour or so. I suppose just the additional bit, which I think falls into a couple of things you just summarised there. It's around that regional working side of it as well, engaging with neighbouring or councils regionally where there's a commitment to work together. Having those conversations as early as possible, I think, it is wise, just given the complexity and the variance.
So that could be number 6. I think that could be number 6, regional working. Right. Well, Mark, thank you very much. That was a really good conversation. I enjoyed it. I hope everybody listening enjoyed it. As I said at the start, we have been recording this, and we'll make it available in the usual way through our website, and we will email it to attendees, and it'll also be on our social media feeds on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. But thank you very much for all your time, and there we are, it's 10 to 12, so you've got 10 minutes of your day back. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Mark.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Andrew.